Miami's got 2 games left on their regular season slate, but in this episode, we're going to recap the conclusion of this doubleheader Miami had with Toronto last night on this Friday's episode of Your Heat Latest on FanArc. Thanks again so much for joining us. I'm Sam Shapiro, and if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, we'll stop what you're doing right now and click that subscribe button. We've got great daily content you don't want to miss, all right here Monday through Friday. And we're also over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify now. So if you want to go over there and give us a listen as well, I'd greatly appreciate it. Fortunately, the second game in this doubleheader Miami had with Toronto last night kind of went how I expected it to, outside of the fact that Miami actually found a way to score more than 100 points in this contest against Toronto. They fell 128 to 114 to close out this doubleheader. And this is the highest scoring performance that Miami has had against the Raptors this year. I'm only saying it because 3 out of the 6 times Miami has been held under 100 points this season have been against this Toronto team. Done a really good job locking Miami up. I believe through the first 2.5 quarters, give or take, Toronto had forced 9 turnovers from Miami, where the Raptors themselves had only just coughed up 1. So, I mean, Miami came into this game also looking pretty strong. Started the game with a 7-0 run, ultimately giving up that lead by the end of the first quarter and then being down by a pretty sizable margin at halftime. I believe it was either a 17-point or a 19-point margin at that point. It was 19, excuse me. They were down 69-50 at the halftime mark. Brandon Ingram had 23 of his season high 38-point performance at that point in the game. RJ had 15 of his, I believe, 23 points in that contest, or 22, excuse me. So, I mean, both of those guys combining for 60 of Toronto's 128 points. I mean, those guys, those 2 guys alone pretty much scored half of the Sixers' points last night. And that's quite honestly, considering that Miami had also 5 players in double figures in this contest, it's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing how good this Miami Heat team has been at throwing away some of the wins that they could have had in the win column for them this season. Especially, again, backtracking to what I was talking about earlier in the last segment, Miami came out in this game hot. Started the game with a 7-0 run. Then ultimately, Toronto chipping away at that through the first quarter. And by the end of that first quarter, they were up against Miami 32-26. And then when you stack Toronto's 37-point second quarter on top of that, Miami's only farting out 24 points in the second quarter. And then they went ahead and did it again in the fourth quarter when you actually had some sort of hope coming out of the third quarter where Miami scored 40 points coming out of the halftime break. Granted, Toronto did score 33 points in that quarter. So, yes, the 40-point third quarter definitely helped Miami make it a little bit of a closer game overall. But when you have to spend the entirety of the beginning of the second half playing catch-up, sometimes you just run out of steam at the end of the game. And even when Miami hasn't been in this having to play catch-up situation, we've seen them have to play catch-up and lose steam entirely. So, frustrating. Frustrating, I think, is the nicest way that I could possibly say how embarrassing it is that Miami actually found a way to crawl back into this game. Again, ultimately what did Miami wrong in this game was letting the Raptors getting out onto a bigger run in the second quarter. Ultimately, the Raptors went on a 24-6 run to close out the half. Was over a just under 6-minute stretch that they only held the Heat to 6 points while they scored 24. Raptors went 8 of 13 in terms of shooting on that run, holding Miami to 2 of 8 on that run as well. So not only did they hold them to poor shooting, but they also prevented them from taking. Toronto almost took double the amount of shots in that 5-minute and 46 time frame where they went on that monster run. Now, granted, a 25-6 run in the third put Miami within single digits. Miami at that point 8 of 10 from beyond the arc, but Or at least at that point in the game, they were shooting lights out. Anyway, them shooting from beyond the arc very well, going on that run of 25-6, or excuse me, they went 8 for 10 from 3 through roughly the first 8 minutes of the third quarter, which is quite honestly much better than any shooting performance we had seen from this Miami team from the outside. I feel like through the entirety of almost any game. I feel like there were a couple here and there, where Miami had shot closer to 60%, but 80% in 8 minutes. Obviously, yeah, it's going to definitely close that lead a little bit, but Miami fumbled the bag, giving up a 12-2 run to start the fourth quarter. This is just another example of how Miami is really good at throwing away. I don't want to say this was an easy win because they were battling from behind, but if you're starting the game on a 7-0 run against a team that has kind of fallen off a little bit, at least in terms of how they've played over the last couple of months, and when you look at their most recent basketball going at least, before this contest going 5-5 in your last 10, you shouldn't have a team that was hotter in the beginning of the year and isn't playing at that same caliber level, beating you in the same fashion that they were at the beginning of the season. So, I don't know. I wish that was kind of the more frustrating part in this whole scenario, because now as we kind of look towards the play-in and potentially what the playoff picture could look like for Miami, I think the more another frustrating topic of conversation is, given the situation with Norman Powell, is the writing on the wall for him right now for him to depart in the offseason. And the only reason I'm saying this is obviously the last couple of games he's been out, still dealing with that groin soreness. He, I believe, returned in this he returned obviously last night in that contest with the Raptors, Norman Powell. But I believe he also was in the contest before that as well. But in both of these games that I'm talking about that he played in, he has not surpassed 20. Well, actually, he returned for the beginning of the doubleheader with the Raptors, playing in 24 minutes, 14 points, 4 of 12 from the field. Then only played 17 minutes in this contest against the Raptors last night. 7 points in 17 minutes. I don't know. I part of me wants to say that they could just be holding him back a little bit because now it's appearing, at least from the outside looking in, Hero could be a little bit more healthy and they're trying to milk as much time he can spend on the court as possible before the postseason play technically starts. But I think this is the time. If Norman Powell is going to continue to see a reduction in minutes and a reduction of a responsibility or role in the lineup, then the writing could potentially, I think, be on the wall for him to be shopped this offseason. I don't think necessarily that's the right move, but I wouldn't be surprised if Miami is still looking at the future of the organization being more centered around Tyler Hero just because he's younger when you look at both players and their inability to play more games than they had over the course of this season. So drop in the comments if you think his limited play coming out of this injury is some signs or at least writing on the wall that we could maybe see a Norman Powell exit this summer. I hope it's not, because I kind of like this Miami offense structured around him a little bit more than Hero. I'm not saying that 100 definitively % means Miami should trade Tyler, but I don't know. There's got to be a way you could try to figure out getting it to work. Miami has surprised me in not doing that so far up until this point, but I try to remain optimistic that what we're seeing now doesn't mean that we are going to see an exit from Powell. And this might be a little bit of a stretch even arguing that. Again, this could just be Miami trying to monitor his load management and trying to just ramp him back into the system softly, because these games ultimately, they do mean a bunch for Miami right now, because it's kind of going to dictate where they ultimately end up going into the play-in, but you never truly know what's going on behind the scenes until it comes out in the reports. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see. And hopefully this doesn't mean that it's signs pointing to a Norman Powell exit. Lastly, one thing I want to talk about here is a potential lottery reform proposal that Adam Silver apparently really liked. And I thought this was pretty interesting reading it as well. It was a report that came from Kevin O'Connor on Twitter. Now, he said, quote, during the NBA GM meeting this week, this came out yesterday, one person suggested making the bottom 3 teams eligible for the top 3 picks entirely. The league, per multiple sources, found this to be way too extreme, but then another person on the call offered a softer version of the same concept. What if the bottom 3 teams just had slightly lower odds than the teams that ranked 4 through 10? Personally, the reason I thought it was interesting that Adam Silver loved this, and again, in what Kevin O'Leary had to say, he said again, not 0, just a little less. And it was interesting to see that Adam Silver responded enthusiastically to this idea. At least that's what sources were reporting. But I definitely think he felt that way because it definitely, at least from the outside looking in, is taking quite literally a direct jab at teams intentionally trying to tank. If you're a bottom 3 team expecting to get a top 4, top 3, maybe the number 1 overall pick, or at least the best stab at it, well, now this rule says, oh, no, you don't. Because what if teams ranked 4 through 10, have odds that are a little bit more comparable? I definitely think if you're Miami, you love this idea because you're the Miami Heat. You're anti-tanking. You're never going to be a bottom 3 team. At least if you're moving in the way of, we're going to try to win no matter what with what we've got, and we're not going to try to intentionally lose games. If I'm the Miami Heat, I'm loving this rule. I think for teams that, personally, I would like to see this rule tweaked in a way that ultimately the amount of games you win dictates if your odds get lowered or not. Because if you're a team and you're winning less than 15 games, that's going to be a really hard argument to say you don't deserve a top 4 pick. And even watching how players like Ace Bailey conducted themselves because they didn't want to play for a team like Utah, I kind of get it. But I definitely think this rule is really interesting, and we're going to see this proposal resurface and potentially get tweaked over the next coming months, depending on how the talks for it kind of develop. Drop in the comments what you guys think, and if this would be an interesting rule implemented by the league to combat, potential teams that are looking to tank. That's going to do it for this Friday's episode of Your Heat Latest on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video, and if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. We've got great daily content you don't want to miss, all right here, Monday through Friday. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sam Shapiro. Have a great weekend.